For years, people believed they had seen everything there was to see about Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson. The films, the interviews, the behind-the-scenes clips, it all felt exposed, analyzed, and understood. But what if the most important part of their story was never shown at all, and what if the truth has been quietly hiding in plain sight this entire time? It all goes back to the 50 Shades era, a period that looked glamorous from the outside but was far more complicated behind the scenes. The chemistry between Jamie and Dakota wasn't just convincing, it was intense enough to blur the line between performance and reality. And while audiences were captivated by what they saw on screen, there were subtle moments off-screen that didn't quite match the polished narrative being presented. In interviews, something often felt off. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be easily pointed out, but in small, almost unnoticeable details. The way they avoided certain questions, the way their tone shifted when conversations became too personal, the way their interactions sometimes felt overly controlled, as if there was something they were both careful not to reveal. At times, they appeared completely in sync, laughing, teasing, finishing each other's thoughts with an ease that felt natural. But then, in other moments, there was a distance that seemed just as real. That contrast became one of the most talked about aspects of their dynamic, because it didn't follow a clear pattern. It felt unpredictable, almost like something beneath the surface was influencing how they interacted. Fans began to notice these inconsistencies and started asking questions. Was it just the pressure of the roles? Was it the intensity of the filming environment? Or was there something more complicated happening behind the scenes that no one was allowed to talk about? What made things even more intriguing was how carefully both Jamie and Dakota managed the public image during that time. Neither of them openly addressed any tension, any confusion, or any speculation. Instead, they stayed within a safe narrative, professional, respectful, and focused on the work. But sometimes, what isn't said can be just as revealing as what is. There were also reports from people who claimed to have observed the filming process more closely. Nothing dramatic, nothing confirmed, but small hints that the atmosphere on set wasn't always as smooth as it appeared. Long hours, emotionally demanding scenes, and the pressure of living up to global expectations created an environment where everything felt heightened. In that kind of setting, relationships don't always follow simple definitions. Boundaries can blur, emotions can become complicated, and what starts as professional connection can shift into something harder to explain. Not necessarily romantic, not necessarily conflict, but something that exists in between, where clarity becomes difficult. One particular moment often resurfaced in discussions, a press interview where both Jamie and Dakota seemed unusually quiet when asked about their connection. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, where neither of them immediately answered. It wasn't awkward in a typical sense, but it felt loaded, as if there was more behind the question than they were willing to acknowledge. That moment became symbolic for many fans, not because it confirmed anything, but because it hinted at something unresolved. A space where answers existed, but weren't meant to be shared. As time passed, the films ended, and both actors moved on to different projects. But the curiosity never fully disappeared. If anything, it grew stronger, because there was never a clear explanation to close that chapter. Just fragments of interactions, mixed signals, and a sense that something had been left unsaid. Now, years later, those same moments are being revisited with a different perspective. What once seemed like minor details now feel more significant. The pauses, the glances, the careful choice of words, they all begin to form a pattern that people didn't fully recognize at the time. And that's where the idea of a hidden secret begins to take shape. Not as a dramatic revelation, not as a scandal waiting to explode, but as something quieter and more complex. A dynamic that didn't fit into a simple narrative, and therefore remained unspoken. Because sometimes, the most powerful truths aren't the ones that are openly revealed. They're the ones that exist in the space between what is shown and what is felt, waiting for someone to finally notice that they were there all along. As the idea of a hidden secret began to gain momentum, a more important question slowly emerged: what if the truth behind Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson wasn't something shocking, but something far more subtle and misunderstood? Because when you look beyond the speculation and revisit their story with a clearer perspective, the mystery starts to shift into something more grounded, yet no less fascinating. The first thing to understand is the environment they were working in. 50 Shades was not a typical film project. It demanded a level of emotional and physical vulnerability that most actors rarely experience. Spending months in that kind of intense, controlled setting naturally creates a connection, but not always one that fits into simple categories like friendship or romance. That's where much of the confusion likely began. What audiences saw was a connection that felt real, but what they didn't see was how that connection was shaped by the context of their work. When actors are required to explore deeply personal emotions on screen, those emotions don't simply disappear when the cameras stop rolling, they linger, creating a dynamic that can feel authentic but also temporary. There's also the pressure of maintaining professionalism under constant public scrutiny. Every interview, every appearance, every interaction was being watched, analyzed, and interpreted. In that kind of environment, even the smallest gesture can take on unintended meaning. A pause becomes tension, a laugh becomes intimacy, and silence becomes something mysterious. Jamie and Dakota's approach to this situation seems to have been consistent: say just enough, but never too much. That balance allowed them to protect both the professional image and the personal boundaries. But at the same time, it created a space where ambiguity could grow, where the lack of clear answers became its own kind of narrative. What many fans interpreted as hidden tension or unspoken feelings may have simply been the result of navigating that pressure. When two people are aware that every word they say will be examined, they naturally become more cautious, more selective, more controlled. That caution can easily be mistaken for something deeper, when in reality, it's just a response to the situation they're in. Another important detail is how differently people perceive authenticity. When something feels real, it's easy to assume that it must come from genuine emotion. But in acting, authenticity is the goal. It's what makes a performance convincing. Jamie and Dakota were not just playing characters, they were creating a connection that needed to feel believable, and they succeeded. That success, however, came with a side effect. It blurred the line between what was real and what was performed, not just for the audience, but potentially for them as well. That doesn't mean there was a secret relationship or hidden conflict, it means there was a complexity that didn't fit into a clear, simple explanation. When you revisit those interviews, those behind-the-scenes moments, and those subtle interactions, they start to look different. Not as evidence of something hidden, but as reflections of a working relationship that was intense, nuanced, and occasionally difficult to define. A connection shaped by circumstance rather than secrecy. And that's where the truth begins to settle. The secret people have been searching for may not be something that was deliberately hidden. It may simply be something that was never meant to be fully understood from the outside. A dynamic that existed in a space between performance and reality, where clear answers were never really possible. By the end of it all, the mystery doesn't completely disappear, but it changes form. Instead of asking what they were hiding, the question becomes why their connection felt so real in the first place. And the answer to that may be far less dramatic, but far more meaningful. Because sometimes, the most compelling stories aren't about secrets waiting to be revealed, they're about moments that were real enough to be felt, but never meant to be fully explained. Because sometimes, the most compelling stories aren't about secrets waiting to be revealed, they're about moments that were real enough to be felt, but never meant to be fully explained.